Just go through the way you're thinking about it. How on earth would this work?
Well, for now, we have only a free trade area between U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and there are already tensions involved. There's nothing, not only to do with, of course, drugs, fentanyl, and migrants, but the U.S. is also concerned about the trade imbalance between Mexico, U.S., and Canada, the very large trade surpluses with the United States. So you can renegotiate the USMCA in a direction of restricting trade, and U.S. is now probably asking Mexico and Canada to also restrict trade in automobiles. There may be 20-25% tariffs on that because there are lots of job loss in the U.S. Or you can do something that is more bold, forming a full economic union that would imply free trade not only in goods, but also in services, in the movement of capital, labor, data, technology, and information. That's what the European countries have done for the last few decades. And from any economic point of view, North America is an optimal trading area that goes beyond goods. Now, one step you can take along those lines before having a full economic union could be, for example, to form a custom union. What's the difference between a custom union and a free trade area? In a free trade area, there is no common external tariff against other countries. So, for example, there are lots of Chinese cars that are now entering into Mexico, while the U.S. has a 100% tariff against Chinese EV. If you form a custom union, the first step for economic union, you'll have to have the same tariff imposed on Chinese cars, whether they go to Mexico or U.S. or Canada. And in this way, you create a full market, for example, for automobiles, and you prevent the imposition of, say, 20-25% tariffs on exports for Chinese cars or parts from Mexico to the United States. So you can do a reform of the trade agreement in the direction of shrinking trade, or you can do it in a direction of expanding trade. And I argue that actually it's an economic benefit of all three countries to expand trade through first a custom union and then a full economic union.
You offer a different vision then first, before we get to the much bigger one later. Can we just talk about the much bigger one? Freedom of labour, free movement of labour between the United States and Mexico just sounds like a complete non-starter. Nouriel, do you actually think that could be a stepping stone further out down the road in the future?
Well, in the case of the European Union, you had the same problem. The countries that were much poorer in Central Eastern Europe, they joined the EU. There was a transition period of many decades until they reached a certain level of per capita income, a certain level of governance, a certain level of reform. Of course, free trade in labor between US and Canada would not be a problem, same per capita income, same culture, language, and actually there'll be probably more people going from US to Canada than the other way around because of global climate change and cheap land in Canada. With Mexico, of course, at current level of per capita income, you cannot have free trade in labor. But as I said, like in the case of Europe, you could have standard criteria that suggest that maybe after 10 or 20 years, when Mexican per capita income is much higher, there's better governance, then you free up that type of trade. So I'd say that in economic union, the part that is controversial is only probably migration of labor. It will be in the interest of the United States to have free trade in goods, in services where it has comparative advantage, in the movement of capital, portfolio and FDI, and of course data information technology where the US has a major comparative advantage relative to Mexico and to Canada. The only controversial part, as I said, is labor movement, but you can restrict it over time.
Nouriel, do you get the sense that anyone in the current administration is sympathetic to this type of proposal at a time where it seems like people are increasingly going for economic isolation rather than reducing the walls entirely?
I will start conversation within the administration on this matter, but I would say that certainly a step towards reforming the USMCA in the direction of a custom union makes sense. Because right now, of course, the automakers, that are the producers, are very worried about the impact on their own production costs and profit margins of restricting and imposing a lot of tariffs on, say, auto trade. The unions and the workers are in favor of it. But the problem is that you're imposing this 25% tariff on automotive trade. The cost of cars in North America is going to increase by 10-20%. That's going to hurt, first of all, consumers, but it's going to also hurt the workers. So if you care about U.S. auto workers, there are two options. One, to impose the tariffs and restricting trade in automotive, but that's going to be bad for everybody. Another one is instead having a custom union, where if you essentially have an external tariff that is common against Chinese autos, then Chinese autos that are not entering the United States today will not enter Mexico either. And therefore, the market for U.S. automakers is going to be much bigger, because you have 120 million Mexicans that need auto and are buying now mostly Chinese cars. So you can have a win-win solution that makes everybody better off, including the auto workers, if you go in the direction of a custom union and eventually an economic union. So you have to go forward rather than going backward. And I think that those arguments can be made in Washington, in Mexico City, and of course in Canada as well.
Nouriel, is this proposal potentially a way that the United States could have more heft when it comes to driving a wedge between Beijing?
Well, certainly one of the concerns that the United States has is not just fentanyl that is coming to the U.S. Via China, but more importantly, that the Chinese have avoided tariffs by essentially exporting goods to Mexico and from Mexico to the United States as if they were Mexican goods. The Mexican production of many goods has a lot of content of parts that is Chinese. And there is also concern about the fact that the Chinese are taking over the auto market of Mexico as well, exporting cheap cars, EVs and otherwise, to Mexico. So if you care about de-risking the relationship with essentially China, whether it's in auto or other critical parts of the economy, it makes sense to have initially a custom union and then having also a full economic union where decisions about how much you trade and do investment with China from North America are done not by the US side alone, and then Mexico can do whatever they want as they do right now, but everything in the context of an economic union and initially a custom union. So it makes sense for the US, it makes sense for North America.